Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, and of course welcome back to the desk corner here, which is not anymore decorated for Halloween, sadly, but we are back to the normal desk corner now. So back in September I created a video and it was kind of just like a guide for beginners with graphite pencils and how you can learn graphite pencils as a beginner, and that video was a little bit short and I had a part 2 in mind when I was creating that video. So this is going to be the part 2 of the Graphite for Beginners series. I'm going to go more in depth in this video. It's going to be pretty long, just a warning. I think it's going to be like twice as long as the first one was because I really want to go in depth about like shading techniques and applying it to real drawings and practicing. So if you haven't seen part 1 yet, I would really recommend that you watch that one first because I go over more basics and things like a grade scale and more blending techniques and things like that. And if you're interested in that and you are a beginner or new to graphite in any way, I recommend you watch that one first and then come back and watch part 2. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into part 2 of my Graphite for Beginners series. Yay! I'm going to start by going over the materials that I'm using. So I have my Faber Castell 9000 graphite pencils and I picked out 5 grades, which are 8B, 4B, 2B, B, and HB. It doesn't really matter what brand of graphite pencils you're using though, but I picked some of the more popular grades because those are the ones that people more commonly have. I'm also going to show you a couple of different blending tools. So this is a blending stump which comes with a lot of graphite sets, as well as a tortillon, which is great for smaller details, but I'm not going to be using these too much in this video, if at all, because they're not my favorite form of blending for graphite. I'm also showing you a piece of thicker paper. This is a Strathmore mixed media or a Strathmore vellum paper, I believe. Either way, as long as your paper has a bit more tooth to it and is not super flimsy, then it should be able to handle the layers of graphite that you add to your artwork. If any of you have trouble finding a good white eraser, I really recommend this one because it doesn't leave a lot of residue and it doesn't smear. So I really recommend this eraser for anyone who has issues with white erasers. And then I also am using a kneaded eraser. This is another common tool that comes in a graphite set, and this is really great because you can shape it for your needs or for whatever you want to use it for, like erasing details or adding highlights. I've also got some Q-tips and a tissue, and this is actually my preferred way to blend graphite. I'm going to start this video off with showing you guys a couple different methods of shading and how you can get some different textures and styles, which is something I didn't go over in my first video for Graphite for Beginners. So in the first cube, what I'm going to do is just create a normal gradient from dark to light. It's very even, you can't really see many pencil strokes, and I'm using the side of my pencil to do this. And then I'm just going to use a tissue to blend it out, and the result is a very smooth surface that is ideal for something like skin or any other smooth surface, and this is a really common method of shading and blending with graphite. In the next square, I'm going to do a bit more of a stylistic and textured look, and what I'm going to do is use small circular motions to shade instead of just shading the normal way that I did in the first square. And I'm still going to create a gradient, of course, from dark to light, so this is going to take a few layers to get that result because I have to be a bit more careful here. I don't want them to be too squiggly and messy. I want them to be a little bit uniform, but I also don't want them to be perfect. And what this does is it creates a bit of a texture that would be ideal for something like maybe foliage or different types of fur or even some types of fabric. And then you don't really necessarily have to blend this out either with a tissue or anything like that. If you want to keep the texture, you can just keep adding layers until you're happy with it. And this is actually one of my preferred ways of shading things like different fabrics for clothing or even just foliage, as I mentioned before. So I really recommend using this if you haven't tried using this method before because the end result is really nice, and even though it's subtle, you can still see a bit of a texture. The next method of shading is fairly popular and many of you have probably already heard of it before, but I still want to go over it because I think it's an important one to know, and that is hatching. So as you can already see, what I'm doing here is using lines to shade the square instead of trying to create any type of smooth blend. The lines should all go in the same direction, at least in the front face of the square, so I could have them going in different directions on the other faces depending on where the shadow is. And I find that the best way to do this is to create a bit of a contour and have your lines move along with whatever shape that you're shading, and just have them kind of curve if they need to so that they look more natural. But you can also do straight lines, especially if you are shading a square that is completely kind of straight like this one. And you also have to make sure that you're creating a gradient from dark to light. So you would add more lines and darker lines to the shadowed areas, and then less lines that are lighter and more spread apart to the highlighted areas to create a bit of an effect like that. I tend to do hatching a little bit messy, and some people like to be a bit neater with it, so it really depends on if you want to do a looser style or more uniform style. That's all up to you. And the final method of shading I'm showing you is actually one of my favorites, and that is cross hatching. You start off the same way that you do with hatching, just creating lines that go in one direction, but then you cross over those lines with lines going in an opposite direction. And you still want to, of course, pay attention to the gradient, so you do get a bit of an effect of dark to light. But I think that this is a really effective method of shading, and especially with pen as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be graphite. I really like to do this with pen, but you can also do this with graphite, which I'll demonstrate later in the video for you guys on how you can use this in a drawing. And I really love to use this method of shading. Probably second to smooth blending would be this method. It is so much fun to do for some reason. I really recommend trying it out and practicing it if you haven't before, because it's just really fun and you never know if you might actually really enjoy using this. Now the next portion of this video is going to be a demonstration, and I thought I would do a little demonstration and show you guys how you can draw water droplets with your graphite pencils, because I feel that this is not super time consuming and they are easy to sketch, so it is a great way to practice with contrast and light and dark values. So the first thing I'm doing is sketching them in, and I am not going to use too much pressure, of course, in my initial sketch, and they are kind of just oddly shaped. Some of them are shaped a bit like teardrops, others are kind of like irregular looking circles. There are some smaller ones, some of them look like beans. They're kind of just irregular looking, and it helps to do that. You don't want to just sketch in perfect circles for this, of course, because that doesn't look as natural. To make it look like the droplet is sitting on a surface, you have to create a bit of a harsh shadow on one side of the droplet. And I'm using my 8B pencil to do this, but I'm being careful to make sure that the shadow is a bit wider in the middle and that it tapers off towards the ends of the droplet a bit, and that will help it to look a bit more natural and not like an outline. There's also a bit of a subtle shadow on the other side of the droplet that I'm going to work on as well, but you might want to switch to using more like a 4B or something like that so you don't accidentally make it too dark. And then I'm going to go and gently shade actually inside the droplet, and for this you want to use a much lighter shade, maybe a B, or a much lighter grade, maybe a B or a 2B or an HB to do this, because you really don't want it to get too dark. I'm just going to create a bit of shading, and the point is that you really want there to be a lot of contrast and have it look like there is light reflecting so that it looks more like water and it looks natural. And having that harsh shadow and then that kind of brighter highlight in the middle creates a lot of contrast and makes the droplet look like it has volume and it's not just completely flat. So this is a really fun exercise to practice your techniques of creating something that looks 3D as well as having a lot of contrast. And then I'm going in with my kneaded eraser to create a bit of a highlight as well. So as I mentioned earlier, those are really great for going in and picking up any excess graphite to either lighten up an area or create more of a highlight. Now I'm going in and working on one of the smaller droplets using the same method. I'm starting out with the shadow at the bottom that tapers off, and then I'm going to shade the droplet a bit and create a little bit of a highlight. Now with this one, what happened was I think I used maybe the 4B to shade it, and I shaded it a little bit too intensely. So what I did is I went in with my kneaded eraser and kind of just tapped on it a bit and picked up all of the excess graphite and then I kind of got the result I wanted just by doing that. You did see me go in with a Q-tip and blend it out before I did that, so that way when I picked up the graphite with a kneaded eraser, I was left with a nice smooth look. Now for the next droplet, the shadow falls more on the left side, so I wanted to demonstrate and show you how that would look. And then of course there's a bit of shadow on the right side as well, but it definitely tapers off in between there, and that is how that is going to look. And then I'm going to shade the inside very lightly, probably with my HB or B pencil. And I just want to show you guys how the shading goes with each of the different shapes of water droplets and how to go about that. So I really hope that me slowing this down and creating a longer video is going to help you guys see a few techniques maybe. You can always skip through parts if you don't feel like watching the entire part, but I did want to make this one longer than the first one, and I really wanted to show you guys techniques and how I do things and just slow it down to the point where you can actually see what I'm doing. I'm going on to work on the smaller droplets, and these are really easy. You actually just have to sharpen your pencil really good and then just create a shadow on one side of the droplet, and that really helps to make it look realistic. And after I do that, I'm just going to work on the bigger and more medium-sized droplets on the right side as well. We'll see if I want to add in some more little ones, because if you add in some extra little droplets, it helps to make everything look more realistic. I think the water droplet study is a really good way to practice without feeling intimidated because of having to do like a really detailed sketch or anything like that, because water droplets are super easy to sketch out and it really won't take too much time at all. So I feel like it's one of those less intimidating methods to practice with graphite pencils, and I really recommend trying it, especially if you are new to the medium or new to drawing in general. Now that I've finished with most of the bigger droplets, I'm going to go back and add some smaller ones to add to the realism. I'm finishing up with this study, and then we're going to move on to a different study that's a little bit more complex, but I'm excited to share with you guys how you can incorporate those textures and shading methods we talked about earlier. Now I'm going to go ahead and go through with the last demonstration, which is this really cute bird sitting on a tree branch. And I think that this was a good image to choose because it is not extremely hard to sketch out since the bird is oval shaped. You can start with an oval in order to do that. And also there are a lot of different textures going on in here to practice with. I'm starting with the underbelly of the bird, which is going to be kind of a dark shadow in the end result, but not extremely dark, but it's still going to be kind of dark. So I'm starting off with that, and we're going to create multiple layers in order to get a nice dark result for that. And then I'm also filling in some other shadowed areas, for example, around the beak and other areas. And of course, the underside of the bird is going to be more shadowed than the top part of the bird because that's where the shadows are being created anyway. As I'm shading, you'll also see me kind of shading in the direction the feathers are going in, and then on the underside of the bird, of course, some of the feathers are going to come off a little bit and you'll be able to see them, so I'm creating a little bit of detail there. I'm going straight in with my 8B for the eye because this area is quite black in the reference photo, and graphite pencils don't get entirely black, even the highest grade. So for that, you have to be a little bit strategic, because if you don't use charcoal or something else along with your graphite pencils, sometimes you don't get the contrast that you want. So what I'm doing is I'm using that 8B for those really dark areas first, because that way I can compare it to the other shadowed areas and make sure that none of them get quite as dark as the areas that are supposed to be pretty much black or nearly black, and that way there's more of an illusion of contrast and it looks more black than it actually is. I'm going to fill in some other areas that are quite dark, like there's an area on the top of the bird's head as well. We're going to do all these areas first, as I said, so I can compare it later and make sure that they stay dark enough. And what really is nice about this too is there's a lot of contrast, because there's a bit of a white area around the bird's eye, which is really going to contrast with the black area and the eye and the beak and everything like that. So I think that when you find a reference photo that has a lot of contrast, it is easier to practice with graphite pencil versus one that doesn't have a lot of contrast. And of course, I recommend changing all your reference photos to grayscale so that you can really see what you are doing. And there's a lot of little areas that have feathers coming off, and areas where I have to create a bit of a feather texture for this one. So you'll definitely see me doing that, and then I'm going to go in and try to blend it out a little bit afterwards. But I do want to mention that you don't necessarily always need to blend graphite out. If you want to, you can do more subtle blending and only blend certain areas a little bit, but you can also just leave the texture and detail that you originally laid out with your graphite, and don't feel pressured to necessarily have to blend everything and create a smooth blend, because depending on what you're drawing, you don't necessarily need a super smooth blend, and sometimes that bit of texture is a little bit better depending on the subject that you are drawing. And now I'm going to start working on the top side of the bird and the tail as well, and I will let you guys watch. There's not much difference in what I'm doing here as what I was doing before, so I'm not going to narrate the entire thing because I'm afraid that I'm going to get really tired of my own voice, and then you guys are as well. So I'll go ahead and just play some music with this. Now at this point I go in with a tissue and blend, and this part of course is optional. It's going to get rid of your texture and details if you do that, but I'm going to go ahead and add more texture on top afterwards. So as I said before, you don't necessarily need to always blend out your graphite work depending on what you're doing. For this one I did decide to blend it out and then add more texture and detail on top again, but you don't necessarily need to. When you do this, you might have to go in with a kneaded eraser and pull out your highlights again, because blending it out kind of gets rid of your highlighted areas. And then you might also have to deepen up some of your shadowed areas and again add the texture on top as well. Now that I've added a bit of texture and I'm happy with the bird itself, I'm going to move on to the bird's legs. And for this part, as long as you make sure that you don't shade in everything the exact same tone and that you have a variation between like shadows and highlights, so some areas are darker and some areas are lighter, and it's the same thing with the beak as well. As long as you do that, it's going to look realistic. When you're new to graphite, I don't recommend like fretting too much over all the tiny little details. Focus more on the big picture and add in some details, but you don't have to worry about all the tiny little details. I'm going to start on the branch now, and I am using an index card to protect the bird from my hand a little bit so I don't smear graphite everywhere. But for the branch, I'm going to use a cross-hatching technique because I want to get a bit of a different texture than I got with the bird. And so what I'm going to do is not completely straight cross-hatching that's extremely neat, but it's going to kind of go in the direction and the shape of the branch and how the branch is moving, and it's going to look a little bit more natural. What I like to do is start with the shadowed areas and create darker lines that are closer together like I did in the example earlier. And then of course for the lighter areas you have to make sure you don't do quite as many lines and you use a lighter grade pencil. So for the darker areas, while I might use my 8B, for the lighter areas I want to use my B or my HB. And then the extremely dark shadows I'm going to go over and kind of multiple times go over and do the cross hatching and create those lines and darken it up as much as I want to until I get the contrast that I desire. And in this picture, the underside of the branch is the area that is really shadowed, and then there's a few shadows here and there on the top part of the branch. Oh, and I did want to mention that when you're sketching your branch, it can be a little bit funny looking. It doesn't have to be totally straight either, because branches have a lot of little like bumps and curves, so don't be afraid to add those in when you're sketching it out. And if I didn't really add those in when I sketched them out, when I sketched it out, I'm actually adding them in now and creating a few grooves and things like that so that it doesn't look completely straight and unrealistic. And I'm just going to use this method of cross-hatching throughout the entire branch, and you'll see that when I'm finished with it, the end result is going to look like a totally different texture than the texture on the bird, which is kind of what I wanted to do. I'm not going to blend this area out though with a tissue or anything, because with cross-hatching, I kind of like to just leave it how it is so that I don't have to go over and add in all those details again. I really don't want to lose the detail here. So instead of blending, I'm just going to build up those layers until I'm happy with the drawing. I've finished up with the branch now. I'm going in and just doing a couple more details on the bird and the branch. So you can see how the branch turned out. There's still a lot of contrast there, and I did add a little bit of variation on the top and bottom of the branch so it's not completely straight. And then of course you have to go in with your kneaded eraser and erase any smudges that you created while you were doing your drawing. But overall, I hope that this demonstration was helpful to you guys, since I showed a few different textures as well as the water droplet demonstration that I did before, and I hope that you guys found something useful out of this video. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video. If you made it to the end, I am especially impressed because it was a long one, but I hope that you guys gained some valuable information and insights by watching this video and that it helps you out in some way. Let me know if you would like me to do another part to this series or what type of graphite videos you would want to see from me. And as usual, please comment below if you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you thought of it or any of your thoughts about this video in general or graphite. And I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks again so much for watching. Bye guys!